A shocking discovery in Paris on March the 7th brought the city to a standstill. An unexploded bomb from the Second World War forced authorities to suspend high-speed train services to London and Brussels and shut down roads in the area. Since then, the French police have successfully defused the nearly 1,000-pound artifact, but it still serves as a reminder of the lasting impacts of war. Now, for more on this often forgotten about history, we're joined now by Souchen, a professor with the University of Guelph's Department of History. Good to have you with us today, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so can you give us some historical context on how the widespread bombing campaigns during World War II led to so many unexploded bombs still being found present day?
There's a lot of reasons why. The Allies bombed the European continent in order to, disrupt the German economy and to prevent the movement of troops around the continent, especially during the lead up to the Operation Overlord and D-Day. And so there's a desire in that sense to bomb rail yards and highways and anything that could help the Germans move troops to the coastline faster. And that's why it's not really that surprising to find a lot of unexploded ordnance around rail lines and things like that.
So what do we know then about the discovery in Paris that we mentioned off the top? And what do you think its presence reveals about the war's impact on the city?
Well, I mean, it's quite surprising the scale of the cancellations. They found the bomb about 500 kilograms, about a meter underneath a main rail line. And so obviously that requires a pretty extensive response for closing down travel and other things like that until it was disposed of. And so it's quite a reminder about these long-term legacies, and especially considering that about 10 to 20% of all ordnance created during the two world wars didn't detonate or failed to detonate. And we're talking about billions of rounds of ammunition, billions of rounds of artillery shells that were produced. So the scale is just it's quite significant and a long-term legacy for sure.
So is it fair to say this was a really big issue, these forgotten war items in the immediate aftermath of World War II? And how did different countries then approach the challenge of disposing of them?
That's a good question. Yeah, it was a major issue. They spent a lot of time cleaning up battlefields after the war, making them safe as possible. But you're looking at bombs being, at different depths underground, which impeded the cleanup. And you're also looking at a situation where, in order to dispose of surplus munitions or captured munitions that the Allies found at the end of the war or had on hand, they threw them into the oceans, and that there were some very limited disposal strategies and methods involved. And so you're looking at hundreds of millions of tons being put into the oceans and off Canada's coast too. We participated in that in the Atlantic and Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of tons were dumped. In Canada too, we have unexploded ordnance problem with our training. It's mainly confined there since obviously we didn't have any battlefields in Canada, but it's mainly confined to our military bases where training took place. So it's a global issue, and hundreds of millions of tons are in the oceans, and hundreds of millions of tons are buried in the ground on former battlefields still.
So then how do regions actually navigate this if there are still so many unexploded bombs out there? How are we still finding them today? Is there not ways to be able to discover them, make sure that they're safely diffused and taken away before, say, projects are built or before an accident happens?
Well, in Europe, it's actually very common to have unexploded ordnance and bomb disposal experts on hand on all construction sites. So they'll often do like an archaeological study ahead of any building project, and then they'll also do a lot of scanning for unexploded ordnance in the area. And quite often they do find it, especially in some of the larger cities and urban areas. So in Europe, they're quite aware of the issue, and it's sort of more of an everyday occurrence. Whereas here in North America, it seems quite out of the ordinary, but for Europe and given the scale of the fighting there, it's not that surprising. So they do manage it in terms of having appropriate staff and expertise on hand, and then they take an abundance of caution, as we saw in Paris, when it comes to dealing with the unexploded ordnance, just in case it explodes.
And Professor, have there been any other major historical cases where cities or regions were significantly affected by unexploded bombs decades after the war ended? Anything that sticks out to you?
Well, most recently in England, actually, there was a case where I think it was in Exeter, where a bomb was detonated and it caused a whole series of damage to surrounding university, I believe, and some of the communities, and houses were damaged, and there was a lawsuit about the whether or not the damages could be claimed by insurance and other things, and it actually came out to be an act of war. The bomb was considered still a legacy of the war, and so because it was an act of war, there was a lack of insurance payments, or there was an unwillingness. So there's some interesting little like legal issues that surround whether or not these bombs are can be dealt with as if it is peacetime as opposed to an act of war. And also in England, there was a death recently in, I think it was January of 2021. An unexploded bomb was picked up by a fisherman, and it exploded underneath the ship and killed one sailor on board.
All right, so now looking at the broader historical picture here, what do you think the continued discovery of wartime explosives tells us about the long-term consequences of modern warfare?
That they are severe, that they are long term. The French government expects to be done cleaning up after the First World War in 300 years. And the depth of the explosions along the Western Front and other places, it left such a profound legacy of environmental contamination and a whole bunch of other issues for public safety. And you're also looking at a lot of issues with these corroding bombs too underwater, impacting food chains, impacting water qualities and things like that. And so these legacies aren't going to go anywhere, and they're actually going to migrate into different forms and different things, because these metal containers are going to corrode away underwater. They're going to corrode away in the ground, and then you're left with the contents that are inside the actual explosives.
And Professor, what other discoveries do you think then could come to light after finding these bombs? Do you think this sheds more insight, more light onto World War II and what happened during that time period?
Yeah, of course. I think there's so many things that are related to munitions production, right? When you're talking about these bombs being produced, they're highly technical. They're very sophisticated pieces of equipment, and it speaks, I think, to a whole variety of commodity chains and industry producing these bombs to the soldiers that are using them at the front. There's a great complexity that's involved in every single one of these unexploded ordnance, and then we are encountering the sort of like leftovers, the legacies of that war.
So fascinating. All right, Professor, thank you very much for your time and your insights today. We appreciate them.
Thank you very much for having me.